FBI files can contain a wealth of information, and not just about the subject of the investigation, but about many other people and incidents that took place. As is common in these documents, they contain a lot of redacted information and crossed out names, so sometimes you get glimpses into some remarkable incidents that took place, but can't determine exactly what occurred and who was involved. But in some cases, there's enough to go on where you can apply context clues, research, and prior knowledge to fill a blank with a name that fits all of the pieces. I applied those tactics in regards to an excerpt I encountered in the FBI file of the former boss of the Lucchese family, Antonio Tony Corallo. I learned of a major plot involving crime figures from around the globe, which then led me to discover a little known but profound underworld figure.
Tony Corallo's FBI file is 3,200 pages long, and tucked away deep inside it are a few paragraphs mentioning Corallo's involvement in a plot to break someone out of prison. However, that person was locked up somewhere in Europe. In January of 1967, Corallo was discussing this plan with a confidential informant and working on the logistics of how to accomplish the prison break. As is the case in this file, the confidential informant's name is excluded and the name of the individual who was incarcerated in Europe is blocked out. Dux was said to be intrigued by the idea of having this person freed from prison and was going to cooperate with some European hoodlums to get it done. So this person must have had strong value to the Lucchese's interests for Corallo to be willing to go through such an effort to have him broken out of prison overseas. Afterwards, there was contact made to discuss this person's escape with representatives of some French Corsican heroin traffickers named the Francisci brothers, Antoine and Marcel Francisci. Marcel Francisci was a French politician, but also one of the leaders of the French Connection heroin smuggling ring and was alleged to be one of the biggest traffickers in the world. The French Connection was the main heroin pipeline that began with opium extracted from poppy fields in Indochina, then later from Turkey. It was then processed into morphine base and sent to Marseille, France. There, the base was manufactured into heroin in underground labs. Then the heroin shipments were taken to the US through Montreal, Canada. The file then says that after meeting with Francisci's people, it was learned that this person's escape had been arranged with some Irish hoodlums.
So 2 of Corallo's associates in England were dispatched to Dublin, Ireland to meet with these Irishmen. After the meeting in Ireland, details of the escape were confirmed, and Corallo's British contact said that before any more moves were made to free this person from prison, Corallo would have to give his okay and guarantee the operation. Corallo and the informant were planning to head to Dublin, Ireland to confer with all of those involved in the plot, and that's where the information in the file ends off. Since the Luccheses were heavily involved in dope dealing and Corsican traffickers were contacted about this man must have been a key person involved in the French Connection. The Corsican's main distributors in the US were New York mafiosi, and at that time some of the biggest heroin kingpins in America were part of the Lucchese family, including John Ormento, Joe Beck, Tony Moon, and Carmine Tramonti.
Now, as for the identity of the confidential informant mentioned in the FBI file, it's most likely one of Tony Corallo's close associates at the time, a man named Herbert Itkin, who was playing both sides as a criminal attorney and an FBI informant for several years. Itkin accompanied Corallo on many of his business trips out of the country and was considered by the FBI to be one of the most valuable informants that they ever had, so it's highly probable that he was the person to reveal this plot.
As for the prison break, it never went through, as there's no mentions in any literature of a person with a connection to heroin trafficking being broken out of a European prison in 1967, or any years afterwards for that matter. So it appears that Corallo either didn't give his go-ahead, or the informant's information led authorities in Europe to be alerted of this plot, and they took extra measures to prevent it from happening. But the question remains, who is this person who was nearly broken out of a European prison? And furthermore, what made him so important to organized crime that French, Corsican, American, British, and Irish criminals would all combine forces in an effort to free him? From the FBI information, it can be deduced that this person had a tremendously high status in international organized crime, was incarcerated somewhere in Europe in 1967, must have been a key component in the French connection, and was known to the Francisci brothers. Additionally, using the same style font as the FBI document, the section covering that person's last name has room for 6 characters. This all points to one person and one person only, who precisely matches all of these items and logically fits the scenario, and therefore could only be the renowned French Corsican heroin chemist, Joseph Cesari. While there were many important pieces necessary to make the French connection work, Joseph Cesari was the most valuable component in this colossal operation during its peak years. So who was this underworld chemist who was nearly subject to what would have been one of the greatest prison escapes of the 20th century?
Joseph Cesari was born on January 2nd, 1915 in Haute-Corse, Corsica. Called Joe by his peers, not much is known about his early life, but he had little education, and at some point in his youth he made his way to Marseille, France, where he worked various jobs, including in the maritime mail service.
To understand how Cesari became the renowned underworld figure that he did, we first have to discuss the tale of his older half-brother, Dominique Albertini.
Albertini worked as a pharmacy technician in his younger days, and by the 1930s he was associated with Paul Carbone and François Spirito, 2 French Corsican mafia bosses who ruled the Marseille underworld. Carbone and Spirito devised a plan to have opium from Indochina refined into heroin in France, then shipped to other parts of Europe and overseas to North America. They called upon Albertini to handle the heroin making, but despite his experience with chemistry, he was unaware of how to go about this process. So he was sent to Paris to meet a man named Charles Fortin, a former pharmacy chemist who was now involved in underworld activities. Fortin had developed a mastery of heroin production and taught Albertini his step-by-step process and passed along all of his personal secrets on how to manufacture the highest quality product. After working under Fortin's tutelage for some time, Albertini had become versed at the procedures and emerged as Carbone and Spirito's heroin chemist. In 1937, a laboratory was set up in Bandul, France, about 45 minutes south of Marseille, where Albertini would process morphine base into heroin. Then traffickers such as the Stifani brothers and Pierre Marini of Paris would facilitate the transportation of drug shipments to the US, where American mafiosi controlled distribution. And thus the French Connection smuggling route was born.
Paul Carbone had numerous people under his thumb, including port workers, policemen, and even the mayor. When Joe Cesari worked as a sea merchant, he used his position to make extra money by assisting in drug cargo transportation. In 1938, police broke up the Bundle lab, and the following year was when World War II began, which brought drug trafficking to a standstill.
Sometime in the 1940s, Albertini introduced his half-brother Joe to heroin making. He taught him the basics and supplied him with chemistry books to read, even though Joe was alleged to be barely literate. To fill in the gaps, he carried out experiments on his own, and through extensive trial and error, he perfected the process. He became proficient at making high-purity heroin, and Joe Cesari soon surpassed his teacher and would become Europe's preeminent heroin chemist.
After the war ended, the heroin pipeline resumed, and Albertini was carrying out business all over the world. He was the top heroin supplier for the French Connection and was connected with mafiosi in Italy, France, Canada, and the USA, with his younger brother behind its production. In 1952, Albertini attempted to enter Canada through the USA and was spotted on a rowboat in Lake Michigan by Detroit Border Patrol. He tried to bribe an agent with $10,000 to let him go, but the honorable lawman refused and Albertini was arrested. He was eventually sentenced to 1 year in prison, then upon his release he was sent back to France. By the mid-1950s, Cesari was recruited by a major drug lord named Antoine Cordoliani, who was a former partner of Francois Spirito. Cesari began manufacturing heroin in a house near Marseille for shipment to Italy. Cargo was being shipped from the port of Marseille, and they also used the services of people traveling to the USA or Canada to carry an extra suitcase full of heroin with them.
Cesari's lab was a well-oiled heroin super machine. One witness said that Cesari was capable of processing morphine base into as much as 30 kilos of heroin in 24 hours without wasting any of the expensive raw material. These figures were unheard of and was believed by French police to represent a record production at the time.
But more importantly, Jo Cesari's product was the purest on the world's market. Most of the best heroin from around the world topped out at about 70% pure before being cut down. But the heroin that Jo Cesari produced was an astounding 98% pure, a grade which was considered nearly impossible to achieve, let alone for a self-taught man in an underground lab. This earned him the nickname Mr. 98%, and it was because of him that Marseille's heroin had the reputation as being the best in the world. And a purer product meant that it could be cut down multiple times over for more profits for dealers and distributors.
The FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, estimated that in 1960, a median average of 2.5 tons of heroin came into the United States from France, and according to Cesari's output, he was behind the creation of a significant portion of that amount. Approximately 80% of the dope that came into the US went to New York City, most of which wound up on Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem and was distributed by the mafia's biggest kingpins.
In 1960, the ring was broken up after two middlemen cooperated with authorities, resulting in numerous arrests on both sides of the Atlantic. Afterwards, Cesari operated out of different labs which were relocated several times.
Cesari's profession earned him tremendous wealth and he lived lavishly. He owned numerous luxury cars and frequented the most expensive venues in Marseille. In 1962, he purchased an enormous estate in the Marseille suburb of Aubagne, called La Roseraie, meaning the Rose Garden. It included a large mansion with a private staff, a swimming pool, park, tennis court, and 5 German shepherds roaming the premises. He was also an avid art collector and owned several rare pieces.
By 1964, Cesari had moved his lab to an old farmhouse near Marseille, which was known as Les Clous Saint-Antoine. His main lab was a rudimentary setup in a laundry room on the estate. He had 4 workers assisting him, one of which was Albert Veran, who was his top disciple and would become a skilled chemist in his own right. It took a minimum of 3 people to work the job, and they all had to wear rubber gas masks, as the fumes produced by the morphine were both toxic and powerful enough to drug a crowd of people in an instant. Creating heroin is quite a detailed process which requires 17 different steps, including treating the morphine base with acetone, heating the solution up to 100 degrees to strain the impurities, and neutralizing the product with chloric acid. It takes just over 24 hours to complete, and after the process has begun, it can't be interrupted. The temperature of the mix also has to be very precise, because if it exceeds 110 degrees, it's likely to explode, and there have been many accidents inside laboratories.
While most labs followed a nearly identical procedure, Monsieur Jo's mastery of the process to create pure heroin was revered as a type of wizardry, as other chemists who were proficient in their own right were unable to even come close to the purity level of his product.
With dope dealing being an enormous moneymaker for mafia families across the globe, as well as for the other criminal organizations that they supplied, for a period of time, Jo Cesari was one of the most important and in-demand crime figures in the world. He was under surveillance by Marseille police for some time, but he was very vigilant and made it difficult for them to track him. He would leave the estate for days at a time and never traveled by air or train and didn't stay in hotels. Whenever he drove his car, he would use different ploys to throw off any tails and would seemingly vanish into thin air.
Throughout the early 1960s, heroin dealers faced increased law enforcement scrutiny, resulting in many busts, both in Europe and the US, which led to a global heroin shortage.
Then the biggest blow to the world's heroin network was dealt on October 12, 1964. That morning, a policeman on Cesari's property, posing as a rabbit hunter who was mistakenly shot by his companion, knocked on the lab's door asking for help. Soon thereafter, the Marseille narcotics squad stormed the lab, where they seized equipment, 67 kilos of morphine base, and 105 kilos of heroin, with an American street value of $3.5 million, over $22 million in today's money. Cesari was arrested along with 4 of his workers. Meanwhile, Dominique Albertini had went on the run to Italy and was being sought by authorities. During the raid at the Saint-Antoine estate, in a back room, police discovered 7-year-old Jean-François Francisci, who was the son of Antoine Francisci and the nephew to Marcel Francisci. One story alleges that during an unannounced visit to Corsica, Antoine found his wife in bed with another man, and he shot the man in the throat. Antoine then returned to France with his son, who he entrusted in the care of Cesari and his wife Renee to keep him away from his mother. This establishes a clear and close connection between Cesari and the Francisci brothers, who would later plot to have him broken out of prison.
A professor of toxicology from Marseille University was invited to inspect Cesari's lab and was quoted as saying, "This isn't a laboratory, it's a kitchen." He also commented on the lack of complexity of Cesari's handwritten notes, saying that it resembled a recipe a housewife would use to bake a chocolate cake.
After Cesari's arrest, heroin production was moved between several small labs capable of producing 2 to 3 kilos every 24 hours. The labs were mobile and could be broken down and moved to a new location in less than 24 hours. But with each new lab setup meant that the operators had to spend time establishing a front as regular residents and build a rapport with neighbors as to not set off any alarm bells. In 1965, Cesari was sentenced to 7 years in prison, the longest sentence of all of those arrested alongside him, with his apprentice Albert Veran receiving the next longest sentence of 3 years. During the years after Cesari was arrested, Albertini was carrying out operations while hiding out in Italy, but at some point he was arrested by law enforcement agents. The subsequent production in laboratories was a far cry from Cesari's output of as much as 30 kilos of pure heroin in 24 hours. Additionally, Cesari was the only one known to be able to produce heroin with a 98% purity level, and thus the product manufactured in ensuing labs was of a significantly lower grade.
Jo Cesari's abilities even baffled professional chemists, especially since he had no formal training. His arrest was a major blow to the heroin industry, as there was nobody capable of filling his shoes.
French and American police had experts try to duplicate Cesari's process to create pure heroin with no success. One story alleges that scientists at the National Center for Scientific Research in France attempted to create pure heroin by following Cesari's recipe and were only able to achieve a purity rate of 67%.
Thus, it's no surprise why global crime figures conspired to have Mr. 98% broken out of prison and returned to his role as the world's most productive and efficient heroin manufacturer. Cesari's top student, Albert Veran, was released from prison in 1969, and being one of only a handful to have learned Cesari's secret formula, he saw his big opportunity to apply his expertise.
Veran and several accomplices opened a laboratory in a villa near Marseille and began to process heroin. But only a few weeks after his release from prison, on March 22, 1969, his lab was raided, and Veran and 4 of his accomplices were arrested. Police confiscated 135 kilos of morphine base and 20 kilos of heroin, and Veran was later sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Dominique Albertini died on February 22, 1970 at the age of 62 while serving a sentence at Les Baumettes prison in Marseille. Cesari was released from prison on December 6, 1970. But after decades of exposure to toxic fumes, he now had serious health problems and had undergone surgeries for cardiovascular issues. Soon after his release, a cab driver named Lucien Giraudeau asked Cesari to teach him how to cook up heroin. The prospect of returning to his famed profession and making fast money was alluring to Cesari, and he agreed under the condition that Giraudeau would handle locating and paying for a laboratory setup. In the summer of 1971, they began operating out of a villa in Aubagne, which was known as Sainte-Suzanne.
Joe's return to the trade was huge for the drug underworld, and it was said that in no time he was back to producing 20 kilos of pure heroin in 24 hours, most of which was sent to the US. During this time, Cesari connected with an old contact of his named Giovanni, who put him in touch with 2 traffickers from Marseille named Louis Rivière and Jacques Messier. They eventually worked out a deal for the sale of 25 kilos of heroin to Rivière and Messier, but as it turns out, Giovanni was actually an undercover narcotics agent. On January 29, 1972, Messier and Rivière drove to San Remo, Italy, with 25 kilos of heroin hidden inside the doors of the car, but they were followed and arrested by French and Italian police. It's alleged that after their arrest, Messier and Rivière had Cesari marked for death, as they believed that he had set them up. The Marseille narcotics squad received a tip that they could catch Cesari in the act if they followed his yellow Citroen 2CV, which they eventually spotted outside of the Villa Sainte-Suzanne. On March 17, 1972, the police arrested Joseph Cesari while he was in a cab, and his wife Renee and apprentice Lucien Giraudeau were also arrested. In his lab, they found 119 kilos of heroin. The celebrated return of Cesari for the crime world was short-lived, and his arrest yet again hindered the dope trade. With the recent passing of stricter drug laws in Europe since his last arrest, Cesari was now looking at a lengthy sentence.
His arrest was a win for narcotics agents, with one French policeman who helped to arrest Cesari saying, "There was no one like him. He was a self-taught man. He'd never had chemistry lessons." Police Commissioner Jean Morin said he is regarded as one of the best heroin processing chemists in the business. And an American narcotics agent had once referred to Cesari as the finest of the fine old hands. Cesari sat in a cell in Les Baumettes prison with a grim outlook. The 57-year-old was in very poor health, his wife was in jail because of him, and he was looking at no less than 20 years in prison, which was effectively a life sentence for him. 5 days after his arrest, on March 22, 1972, Joseph Cesari hung himself with a bedsheet in his jail cell.
He left behind 2 notes, one to the judge on his case where he asked his body to be given to his family, and one to his wife where he professed his love for her and apologized.
The timing of Cesari's death would coincidentally, or perhaps fittingly, be symbolic of the end of the French Connection. 2 months prior to his death, ringleader Jean-Baptiste Cruz and many others were busted after American and French authorities seized 49 kilos of heroin at the Paris airport. This set off a ripple effect which crippled the operation, and by 1974, the French Connection smuggling route had been permanently dismantled.
Joseph Cesari's ability to create such a powerful and pure substance in makeshift labs that was capable of earning billions of dollars has something of a sorcerer's mystique to it. Drug traffickers and mafia bosses rarely know the name of the person processing their product in some foreign laboratory, but at one time, Joe Cesari's name rang through the international underworld like a chef's name would ring through the restaurant world. To be in such high demand that a global criminal empire would orchestrate a plot to break him out of prison speaks to the unprecedented level of regard that Cesari had earned in his craft. By the time any kind of narcotic gets into the hands of a user, it's been diluted numerous times over, but at its inception, there's almost an illustrious quality in the power of its unaltered purity. With even seasoned professionals being unable to duplicate the heroin grade that Mr. 98% achieved, makes this uneducated, self-taught former sea merchant perhaps the most proficient illegal drug chemist that the world has ever seen.